Perhaps some of it is selfish because it generally covers the most creative part of our business. But I know that's not what you're going to talk about today. The townhouse transaction business is nuanced, and for the brokers in this room that I know are of the most creative in the business, you all have a lot to say. So keep today's class interactive, as you always do with Pierre, and Pierre strongly encourages. Pierre, thank you so much again. Take us home.
Thank you, buddy. Appreciate it. Well, thanks everybody for jumping on today. We have a really good group, and for those of you guys, I believe a lot of people, I'm looking through the list now, have been taking our classes consistently. I preface everyone by first off saying I hope everybody's still healthy and safe and hanging in there through these times. And also to, I've been really enjoying doing these classes with you guys. We've been opening them up to the entire real estate community, and it's been a great way for us to just, keep in touch with everybody, compare notes, stay positive, add a little sanity to the day, which is nice. Those you guys, so I've been doing a NYRAC exclusive Q&A or CE every Tuesday, and that's been our game plan for the entire time of this shutdown. And what I'm also doing, if you guys go to our school, so you guys know we issue the CE credits through a school called the New York Real Estate Center. So if you go to the website, nyrecenter.com, you'll see our schedule of general classes for the entire week. We're starting to get other approved instructors to teach. So I believe we're doing almost one a day at this point. So if you get sick of seeing my face all the time, go to the website. There'll be other instructors for you guys to hear from. But with that being said, we have a smaller group than we've been having for this one. So I'd love to keep this session a little more interactive. I love hearing your guys' questions. It's easier to manage the interaction with a smaller group. So let's definitely just keep it more of a dialogue today than as opposed to a lecture. So with that being said, I'll give you guys kind of a funny story how we came up with this topic. I was asked about, God, it has to have been 10 years ago, to do a presentation on townhouses for a sales meeting. When I sat there, I'm like, what am I going to talk about townhouses about for 20 minutes? Like, this is crazy. It's townhouse, right? It's not that intricate. I put pen to the paper, and I went through in my head every complicated townhouse transaction I ever did, and basically took the elements of that to create the outline. And I was like, you know what? This is really 10 times more convoluted than I initially expected. And we created this topic's actually approved for 3.75 credits for CE, meaning it's almost 4 hours of curriculum. We're doing it only for 1.5 today because talking into a phone is really challenging for a 4-hour time period. But, to be honest with you, it's a great topic. I go through the details, and I know a lot of you guys have not done townhouse deals before. Whenever I do this class, I ask people in the audience, what percentage of you guys have done townhouse deals? And it's far less than half that actually raise their hands. And often, then everybody walks out who's never done one, and they're scratching their head. They're like, I'm never going to do this. This is too complicated. Like, Pierre made this out to be, such a mess. I'm really just focusing on the unique aspects of it because that's what's fun to talk about. The fundamentals of a townhouse are not terribly complicated, and we will go through those as well. But I mean, like you guys know, it's the top agents in New York City. You don't make your name doing straightforward, cookie cutter transactions. You make your name in doing what's complicated that other people can't do, and that shy away from. And that's where this topic's, such a valuable topic. So let's start, with some of the fundamentals. And I'm going to talk about what we're going to do in today's market. The biggest difference between townhouses versus other residential properties. Obviously, for you guys, you don't have to deal with the board, which is clearly nice, right? There's no application, any of that stuff. But how does it collectively change our due diligence on a property? Now, for those of you guys who have done this before, clearly the first thing is going to be, when is our inspection going to be conducted, and making sure that the property is current use is in alignment with the legal and permitted use. So when I say all that, I've come into a lot of your guys' sales offices over the last couple of years, and one of my favorite presentations I do is I go through ACRIS, Department of Finance, and Department of Buildings websites. And I basically show you guys how to navigate all these websites because, in reality, while it's the lawyer's responsibility to do this, clearly there's a lot of lawyers out there who don't do it. So you never want to fully rely on that unless it's someone you work with regularly and know. And number two, you guys are involved in such an early inception of the deal. I mean, you can be working on a deal for 6 months before I'm engaged. So if you're representing a seller, I always say, you get a listing for a townhouse. You want to go through, accuracy. You want to see what name's on the deed. You want to see what liens exist. Is it just a mortgage? Is there an IRS tax lien? Is there anything funky that pops out to you that you want to run by us? You want to go through Department of Buildings. One of the most complicated aspects of a townhouse are the CO issues. Like the CO laws didn't come into effect until 1938. Every townhouse built prior to 38 is grandfathered in. Majority of these townhouses, I mean, you guys know, who wants to take a guess? What percentage of townhouses were built prior to 1938? I'm going with 90%. What do you guys think? At least, right? So how do we go back in time 130 something years and find out, what was the legal use of this property? So majority of these townhouses do not have COs. So go to DOB. I'm going to talk about violations. I'm going to talk, about property tax valuations, things of that nature. But the first thing is, you're negotiating a deal for a townhouse. The first question is going to be, when's the engineer's inspection being done? I had a deal I was working on, and this is something that for those of you guys who are trying to negotiate deals now, where you can try to negotiate for a due diligence period. So this concept of a due diligence period is really based on market conditions. And in a market like this, where clearly there's hurdles to getting anything done and people are having issues, you may not be able to get, you clearly may not be able to schedule an inspection, get everything lined up. However, your buyer may want to secure the property as early as possible. So I negotiated for this. I was working on a $22 million purchase of a church. I was representing a mosque that was buying a church to convert it. And they wanted to make sure they can raise the funds in order to proceed, but they didn't want to lose the property. So we negotiated for a 45-day due diligence period where we signed the contract immediately. We had 45 days to conduct our engineer's inspection, conduct our, CO searches, to conduct our architect's opinion in terms of the conversion, and also to raise the funds. And that way, it's a soft contract in a sense, but at least we secure the contract from the buyer's perspective, and the seller realizes that the contract does not go hard until that due diligence period has been waived. So in a bull market, you're not going to get this, right? In a bull market, everybody's waiting in line, everybody has inspections, and it's signed yesterday, or you're going to lose a property. In a market like this, that's a way to preserve a deal and get deals signed with taking into consideration all these factors that we're going through. So certainly, keep the concept of a due diligence period in mind when negotiating now. Those of you guys who've done townhouse deals, has anybody negotiated a due diligence period in the last couple of years?
I mean, like very short windows, like 2 weeks at most for like finance or mortgage contingencies. But for the most part, sellers are very, very wary to take their property off the market to allow it. But, if it's been on the market for a long time, or, there's nobody else bidding on it, or it's just slow. I mean, it's not, 2 weeks is 2 weeks. It's nothing. It's a blink of an eye.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, the issue really is that you can't get everything done in the time frame that the seller wants you to get it done in order to sign a contract, right?
Right.
And the risk to the seller is that they just wasted a couple weeks paying their lawyer to negotiate this, and the deal dies.
Right.
There's a number of things you can do to, make it palatable for the seller. There could be a penalty that if you exercise the contingency and cancel the deal. There could be parameters, so it's not so open-ended, where it's limited to certain issues. We've had them where there was significant, DOB concerns, and we would limit it to, solely if X, Y, and Z related to DOB records in a CO or violations wasn't remedied. So it doesn't have to be so open-ended, but it's certainly, the reason we like it too is that, in the one I described with the mosque, we actually had a 30-day period, and we ended up extending it. Once you have, that deal in contract, and that buyer engaged, you can get a sense if they're serious and if they're proceeding in good faith. If they're proceeding in good faith, and you can assess what the issues are. Then, to be perfectly honest with you, in that situation, you know, you can make a business decision whether it's smart to extend the date or not. So that's why, you know, in unorthodox circumstances, I think it's a great avenue to pursue. Again, on the engineer's inspection, you know, I think you guys, you know, you're the biggest sphere of influence for every service provider in a real estate transaction. I think it's imperative for you guys to have a good engineer, you know, in your Rolodex to make that referral, because I've seen engineers' reports kill deals. You know, I've seen them come where there's been a monstrosity of a 150-page report, and you're sitting there and you're like, you know, client looks at it, it's like, oh my God, this place is collapsing. You know, the report, you have to keep in mind, there's a lot of liability for the seller, for the inspector in terms of issuing the report where if something goes wrong, a buyer can pursue recourse. So a lot of inspectors will be over conservative and go overboard with their assessment, and that's what kills deals. Mm-hmm. So make sure you have a good inspector in line, someone that's quick. Obviously, if you don't have a due diligence period, the moment you have an accepted offer, you got to get somebody in there to, you know, within 48 hours. So I think the biggest factors are someone is quick, responsive, and, you know, has a concise report that's not, you know, going to kill a deal. So that's on the engineer's inspection. Anybody have any questions on that aspect?
I mean, if somebody wants to find a reason to walk away from a deal, they'll find a reason, you know, so that's my sense. I mean, you know, you have an engineer's inspection and there's reasons to doubt it. I mean, if it's a buyer that's serious, I mean, I don't get the sense that they're typically ones that will walk away from something if they're invested in it somehow. You know, they've taken time and they're connected to the property, and there's you know, but if there's, you can sense if somebody's like on the edge, and, you know, that long report or that extensive report will be the tipping point, then it will be the tipping point. But it's like, to a certain extent, that's out of our control, right? So which is why we typically like to have it done before the contract gets signed.
Of course, yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. I mean, what have you seen is the major reasons for an engineer's inspection killing a deal? I
mean, I've had so many recent ones. I mean, before this whole epidemic thing, but like, I had a woman who looked at a multi-unit building, and the guy came in and spent like 6 hours going through the building. It's an old building. It was built turn of the century. It's a wreck. They knew it was a wreck, but they just, you know, for the most part, it's going to be more than we thought it would. So that's the typical response. It's going to cost more than we thought it was going to cost, even though they knew going in that it was going to be a gut renovation, right? Like, you can tell them all you want, it needs everything. It needs a gut. And then they walk in and they're like, oh, well, it needs more than we thought it needed. Like, what part of it needs everything don't you understand? But like, coming from an engineer, I guess that's their reason to walk, then, you know, hearing it officially, I guess, gives them permission to say, I'm not into this. Mm-hmm. But I think it's just typically, I mean, as opposed to like a renovated house that has like things that are hidden, that's a whole nother story. But unrenovated properties, I feel like people just, you know, they don't want to hear that it's going to cost X dollars as opposed to thinking that it was going to cost less. So I think it's just, you know, hearing it from an engineer, oh, you know, the roof needs to be replaced, you know, there's asbestos in the basement. I mean, those are the big things, right? And then of course, structural integrity, like, oh, well, there's you know, this one particular building that, you know, it's sloping, you know, the staircase is sloping because it's an old building that hasn't been renovated, right? So they're like, oh, there's structural issues. I'm like, it's an old building, like all old buildings are going to slope.
It's funny you bring that up, right? Because we tell clients, you're buying a 120-year-old property.
Right.
Like, you know, there will be some degree of structural imperfection.
Right.
As long as it doesn't, you know, look, at the end of the day, a lot of townhouse buyers get it. As long as it doesn't compromise the structural integrity of the building or pose any, you know, risks or issues, most clients get it because they understand I'm buying a 120-year-old property. It's not going to be perfect. From my experience, a lot of the time, you know, a sophisticated buyer will assess it where they'll find out what the life expectancy of some of these issues are. So I had one where the engineer had suggested that they replace the roof, and, you know, obviously roof replacement's a substantial sum of money. Mm-hmm. And the next question is, well, what's the lifespan you think on the current roof? And the answer is 5 to 7 years. So it's two big, it's two drastically different things. Replacing the roof is a suggestion, and advising you that you have over half of a decade to, stretch out the current roof. It's two totally different scenarios, because on the latter, you can financially budget and plan for an expenditure that magnitude in 5 to 7 years time, as opposed to the psychological aspect of having to do it today, while at the same time while spending millions of dollars in acquiring the property.
Right.
So it's really important to go through, all the specific items in a report. And then, to be honest with you, oftentimes there'll be a credit, there'll be an escrow, depending on what the issue is. There's a lot of ways to resolve it, but Lydia, I totally agree with you. If a client wants to get out of a deal, they're going to look for any excuse to do so. And oftentimes this is the excuse, So at some point,
Pierre, is there ever an instance where the seller would do an engineering report, like when she lists?
I'm glad you bring that up. People do suggest that. Here's the pro and con to it. The pro is you can find out what's wrong with the building and maybe take a proactive measure in fixing it in advance of marketing it or selling it. The con is some sellers are going to say, hey, don't waste time in getting a report. I already got one. Here it is. Just take mine and sign tomorrow. As a buyer's counsel, I advise buyers against taking the report of a seller. You never know what it contains. You never know what it doesn't contain. If I'm a seller and I'm in the business and I may know a guy who, there's a million ways to play some game in that situation, that it does pose a substantial risk, in my opinion. So if your seller wants to find out what's wrong with the property for the intent of addressing that to avoid future issues, then yes, it makes sense for the seller to get a report. If the seller wants to get the report to expedite signing and push it off to the buyer, I don't think most buyers would go for it.
Yeah, I think that I'm working with someone right now, and I think the question is, it's an estate, and so it's like, what kind of representations can she make having never lived in that particular house?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so,
well, I mean, with an estate sale, you don't make any representations, right? Like,
right, exactly.
It's strict as is condition. You don't like it, don't take it.
Right.
And oftentimes executors of the estate aren't going to want to undertake to repair a property, during marketing it. Just is what it is. Somebody else, I'm seeing a lot of questions in the message chain. So I do this on my phone, so it's hard for me to keep up with the chain. So if you guys have any questions, please blurt them out.
What?
Anybody? Okay, cool. So the most important aspect of this topic I want to talk about are COs. Somebody just emailed. I saw something pop up. I'm glad they did this. Environmental problems. Thanks for bringing that up. Environmental inspection is an important thing to discuss. If for instance, that there's been any previous leaks, oil tanks under the building from years ago, things of that nature. If it's a commercial property, if you're obtaining financing, you may be in a situation where you have to get an environmental inspection. There's a phase 1 and phase 2 report, or what they're referred as. It's very common in commercial transactions. Banks will require them. It's not very common in a standard townhouse deal. It's really only if there's a specific thing you're concerned with, where you feel like there could be an environmental issue, but we don't do them across the board on a townhouse deal. The size of the properties and the use isn't complicated or convoluted enough that, there's a high chance there's an environmental issue. So thank you for bringing that up. So now on COs, right? A lot of the time on these townhouse deals, I always say, I do a lot of work in Upper Manhattan for townhouses. And I use this as an example. I love the West Harlem market. The townhouses there are stunning. I mean, they're landmark. They're historical architecture. They're really, they're beautiful properties that have been around well over, late 1800s. The problem with that market, for example, is a lot of people, and you can say the same for parts of Brooklyn, a lot of people do work illegally without obtaining permits, changing COs, and so on and so forth. So if you go look at a property, years ago I went to look at a property with a client of mine, and it was a renovated 3-family property. I went home. I pulled up the DOB records. The last CO of record was for a single family, and it's from 20 years ago. So the seller did all this work to the property illegally, marketed as a 3-family, and we have clearly a violation up and down, left and right in terms of actual use, illegal work done to the property, no sign-offs, no permits, nothing. So it's imperative to always pull up the CO. And then if you're on the listing side, you want to pull up the CO, make sure to issue spot, it's the DOB website. It's very simple to use. You go to the DOB website, gives you the CO link, and then it gives you a description of the property where some of the most important aspects, it'll say landmark, yes or no. It'll say SRO, single room occupancy, which I want to talk about, yes or no. And they'll give you violations, open violations, violations of record, ECB violations. So, I'll give you a great example. I had one years ago. My client was buying a townhouse for like a little over $2 million, Upper Manhattan, all cash deal. I pull up the records, see that there's 25 violations. I negotiated my contract. Seller will remove all violations as a condition of closing. Great, did my job, no monetary cap, they agree to it, so on and so forth. Mistake I made, and I learned my lesson, is I assumed that the seller's lawyer was aware of all the violations and agreeing to such a provision. The seller's lawyer never went on the DOB records, nor knew the extent of the violations. He or she just agreed to it. So I'm legally protected, and I closed with all of them being removed. But the issue was, it took like 4 or 5 months. Because, when I go through all these violations, it's an intimidating phrase, but when you go through each one, a lot of them are trivial. Like one of the violations was that the handle rail walking up the stairs was wobbly. One was that a light bulb in the front was not working. A lot of them, and then they dated. I think on this one, the dates were, there wasn't one violation within 10 years of the date we were selling the property. So chances are they had been remedied. They just never been removed of record. So in that situation, my clients say, look, I'm buying cash. I thought I'd close in 2 weeks. Why is this happening? And I'm like, look, we can do 2 things. You can close in 2 weeks. You can take subject to the violations. They're all, here you go. Here's a list of them. Again, they're all trivial. And then you can, in 7 years, when you go sell the property, you can either remove them yourself or keep them of record and see if the buyer in 7 years raises issue with this, right? It's your decision to make. We can negotiate for an escrow, albeit I don't know what the total sum will be given the fact of how outdated these violations are. Or C, we can wait till they do what they're contractually obligated to do, which is remove all of them before closing and convey to you title. But unfortunately, we're sitting, waiting for 60 days. We ultimately chose to delay. But the thing is, if you're a listing agent and you pull this up, I always say, assume your seller knows nothing about their property. Assume that seller doesn't have a clue they have 25 violations. In 2 minutes, you can pull it up and say, hey, look, here's a list of violations. Chances are your buyer will ask you to remove these. Do you have an expediter that you can engage while we're marketing the property for the next 4 months and remove them to avoid any delays in closing?
That's what you want.
When you're talking $2.5 million, you're talking a 60-day delay. You're incurring the carrying cost of the property. You're incurring the risk and liability that something goes wrong, and the opportunity cost of not having that money. This could have been easily addressed in 5 minutes of work. So that's why I emphasize, it's not your guys' job to do the due diligence on these buildings, but, to do a quick search and, using, people like me as a resource and people like TitleVest as a resource to go through these things, I think it behooves you guys. I think it's a smart thing to do. It doesn't pose any liability to you. It doesn't take up an exorbitant amount of time. And honestly, I just think it makes you that much better at what you do and that much more, marketable towards potential clients. It's an added skill set in a sense.
I think if you're going to be a townhouse broker, it's incumbent upon you to do all of that due diligence. It just is going to help you to do your deal.
That's not all.
Not all violations are created equal. C of O's are, it's a very easy conversation to have a conversation about C of O's if you know what you're talking about, right? And it's super important if you have to also check I-cards. Very important, because buildings that don't have C of Os might have I-cards.
Yeah.
And I-cards are also a legal Department of Building document
Mhm.
and can uncover really important things about the use of the house, and whether or not you might have to file an Alt 2 or an Alt 1 permit when you do a renovation. There, you know, and all that stuff is available if you know where to look for it. And
Hey,
you
Doug,
should. Absolutely.
let's chat about iCards for a second, because a lot of people
Okay.
probably aren't going to be familiar with the phrase. So back in the day, before the concept of a CO was created, what Doug's alluding to is that the DOB would have a guy literally write in beautiful penmanship, well, not always beautiful, but would write in cursive on a little card describing the property and what its permitted use is. And they file it with the DOB, and it's still there at the DOB's records from 1892 in this beautiful penmanship. And when we don't have a CO and we're concerned, okay, what is the legal use of this? You're going to have a lot of townhouses where you're looking at this, and you're like, I can't tell what the legal and permitted use is just based off of, you know, physically viewing the property. You know what I do in that situation? I call Nick. TitleVest sends an examiner down to the DOB records, and the examiner goes through all the microfiche or whatever the case may be, a list of all these little cards, and they get this information for us. Because, you know, one common mistake people make is that they'll just say, hey, Pierre, why can't I go to the Department of Finance record, pull up the tax bill, and it tells me tax class 1, you know, 1 to 2 family. Now, the Department of Finance and the DOB don't working, you know, hand in hand with one another. So there's no line of communication between the two. The person in Department of Finance, you know, for all we know, they may simply drive by the property and give an assessment based off of viewing it from the outside, and they're creating a tax classification. They don't care what the legal or permitted use is, or all they care is, you know, what's the current use and how much tax revenue can we derive off of this. So, you know, to Doug's point, you know, I didn't want to emphasize this too much because I didn't want to intimidate too many people with adding more work to your plate. But if you are a townhouse broker, you aspire to be known in that area, what I'm talking about is imperative. You know, this is a unique aspect of it. And this is what is going to make you stick out. So in any event, anybody have questions on COs before I have a couple more things on the topic I want to talk about.
Pierre, I just want to jump out and offer it to everyone as you have. Everyone, this is information that we have generally at the ready at TitleVest. So to the extent that you would like us to do a quick workup on the building, if we have ready access to the, to the C of O or what violations may be present, do not hesitate to reach out. We can generally work this up for you in a matter of minutes. And it is, that minutes will save you, as Pierre alluded to, in the worst case scenario, months, in fact. So reach out to us, let us know where we can help. And thanks for mentioning it, Pierre.
I have a question for you, Nick, actually. Yeah. Will you actually order the file on the building from the DOB? You know what I'm talking about? I mean, every building has an actual hard file, and it's a question of whether the file is on-site or off-site. Do you guys do that work?
So yes,
that's like kind of like I mean, expediters, of course, do that work, but
so in our generally it happens. I would say at this point, New York City Department of Buildings, I think, maintains that they have 90% of their records online. I'm going to say that's around 80. It would be the real answer. And so we can generally pull things like certificates of occupancy, plus or minus certain documents right off the web.
Right. I mean, iCards are on the HPD site, right? Yeah.
And so to the extent it's not on the website, what we do is hire an examiner, and we actually have a few of these people employed by us directly, so they're not third-party representatives. So we send somebody down to the Department of Buildings to do the research and due diligence and extract whatever document that may be house help.
That's what I'm talking about.
We sure do. Cool. Yeah. So we have somebody in house.
I have an interesting curb cut situation going on with a townhouse property that I might have to actually travel down, pulling the file on. I mean, there's a certificate of occupancy that I found for an adjoining property that calls out this property as parking in 1956. So you would make the assumption that the if they can park on the lot, that they have to be able to get across, and there's a physical curb cut there.
Okay.
But that all, the zoning has changed. It's now R5B zoning. So R5B zoning is, you have to have 40 feet of frontage to get a curb cut. This is a 25-foot lot, and the buyers want to build a building on the lot. It's just a lot. And so we might have to get it updated if the certificate of occupancy that we have doesn't fly through due diligence, which would require trying to find the actual, like a drawing or something in a file at the DOB that would support getting the curb cut, updated and legalized for today's, right?
Yeah, interesting.
Tricky one.
Shoot me a note about that privately, and I'll and we can
I think
figure out what we.
I think it'd be great for the three of us to talk about after this. We can definitely, schedule time.
Sorry, don't mean to get all.
No. It's a great example about how complex these matters can get.
Yeah, that's my whole point of this. I always open up with this joking about how we think it's a basic topic, myself included initially, and when you go into it, you see how convoluted it is. Let me talk about a couple CO items which are extremely important for you guys. So when you go to the DOB website, one designation for those of you guys who do a lot of work in Upper Manhattan in Brooklyn is an SRO designation, single room occupancy. So with these properties, typically there will not be a CO. And then you go on the left side of the DOB website, where it says landmarks, it has a couple other line items. One will just say SRO restricted, yes or no. Now, the importance of being aware of SRO is that it's a concept that was created in the late 1800s, where Upper Manhattan was viewed to be the country. If you guys look at pictures of Harlem from the 1800s, it was horse carriages and grass. And what they would do is that they would zone these buildings for SRO restrictive use to create transient occupancy for laborers who are working in central Manhattan. So basically low income wages that were, working as laborers, to provide them with a very low cost rent for using these properties. Now, fast forward to present day, somehow this designation still exists. And if you guys have ever been involved with a rent stabilized, rent controlled tenant, SROs makes rent stabilization look like Disney World. Dealing with an SRO tenant is extremely, confusing, because chances are there's no leases. The regulations behind them are obsolete to a large extent. Nobody wants to buy a property and maintain SRO tenants. Nobody does. You can buy a property and maintain rent stabilized tenants. At least there's some kind of structure, albeit I don't think a great one for that. There is some level of structure. So in going through SRO, what you're going to be confronted with is that people don't necessarily disclose it's SRO. And if they do, they'll tell you, seller's willing to obtain a certificate of non-harassment, or seller is not. In a bull market, sellers are going to ask for market rate for their properties and say, buyer beware, and you deal with the SRO tenancy. Oftentimes your properties are going to be vacant. And the question is, well, it's vacant, so what's the concern? It's been unoccupied for a prolonged period of time. What's the risk of this SRO thing coming to, give me a headache down the road? The problem that we have is that nothing precludes an SRO tenant from popping up in a couple months and saying, hey, I had right to use of occupancy of this property. I'm restoring my status as an SRO tenant. Good luck to you. You guys know New York City courts are extremely tenant friendly. Now more than ever after our rent reg changes from last year. So what you want to do in the SRO situation is that you want to assess in terms of, is the building occupied or vacant? In a situation where it's vacant, if your buyer is willing to assume the element of risk of obtaining the certificate of non-harassment, the legal document you need to obtain to change the status. So if I'm a buyer, I see this beautiful old townhouse in Harlem, and I'm going to renovate it, and I can just envision this being stunning, and I'm going to live there as a single family residence. This is going to be my home. And how do I go about this process, which is a very common type of SRO buyer? You go through it. An application for obtaining the certificate of non-harassment isn't extensive. And the parameters, unfortunately, aren't very clear. Luckily, one of my partners in my firm is a landlord-tenant litigator, and his expertise evolves all around rent regulation. And he actually obtains the certificate of non-harassment for our clients. So he makes the application. And, you know, what you're really trying to demonstrate to the DOB is that all the SRO tenants have voluntarily vacated the property and that there's been no claims to right or use of the property since. So how do you do that? Because if you have 8 tenants and they left, chances are they're not providing you with notice where they went. You don't have any contact information for them. How do you get them to sign an affidavit saying they left voluntarily? There's probably no buyout. It's probably just transient, occupants. Now, you have to demonstrate to the DOB, to the best of your abilities, that they did leave and it's been vacated for a prolonged period of time. So how do you do this? I always recommend you take an ad in the newspaper, you know, like when an LLC has to publish in a paper, you take an ad notifying the whole world that you're applying for the certificate of non-harassment. You have any claims now, speak or forever hold your peace. Secondly, you put postings throughout the building, making this application where presumably if somebody has a claim, they'll see that notification posted and they'll notify the DOB. Third, you try to contact them at any address you may have, send them a letter. Lastly, take the electric bills for as far back as you can go. You know, if you have a 5,000 square foot property, 3,000 square foot property, and electric bill has been $80 a month for the last 3 years, chances are, you know, it wasn't an occupied property. The more you can demonstrate that the vacancy, the better your case is. The negatives to you, if you are a landlord with a bad record, the local community boards and DOB do go back and investigate the landlord. So if you have any claims against you in housing court or, you know, through DHCR, that's going to be an impediment to you getting your certificate of non-harassment. So in going through this, clearly you have to have the appetite for risk to a degree, right? But, you know, if you have that client, it's a matter of educating them on the process and having the right people can help them obtain this certificate of non-harassment. And once you obtain the certificate of non-harassment, I believe it's good for 3 years, if I recall correctly. You then apply to the DOB for your permits to conduct the work. You conduct the work. You present. You sign. You have all the sign-offs on the permits. You have the certificate of non-harassment, and you get a brand new clean CO dated 2020. So it's something that, you know, again, don't necessarily shy away from it. It clearly requires a buyer with the appropriate appetite, but it can be done, and it's done frequently. Let me ask you guys, has anybody ever done a deal involving an SRO townhouse?
Many deals.
Who's chatting? Oh, sorry.
Doug Bowen.
Hey, Doug.
I've done a ton of SRO and rent stabilized deals.
Do me a favor. Give me an example of a convoluted one.
An example of a convoluted one would be a 8-unit building that I sold on St. Mark's between 5th and 6th, owned by these two very old school Brooklyn dudes. I call them my Siegfried and Roy couple. And if you saw their faces, you would know why I called them that. And I sold a number of their properties. And all of these, it was completely occupied. All of them were rent stabilized. All of the building had been cut up into, there was one free market unit, which was the garden apartment. And then all of the other apartments were back and front studio apartments, right? But all of the work in all of the apartments had never been filed at all, right? So there was all kinds of venting issues, everything that you could imagine. The good part about it was that the landlords had filed and kept very good records with the DHCR, right? So that helped our situation with the buyer. But the biggest problem was the physical structure itself and the non-conforming work, and mostly because the venting and plumbing issues were considered after the inspections to be serious on many levels, on a fire and safety level. The layouts of the apartment were also problematic, but the cash flow was good. And it's one of the rare times where at the end of the day, I put buyer and seller into the same room to be able to talk through the property with each other in order to eventually find a comfort level to get it done.
So let me ask you this. So essentially your buyer assumed the risk of all the work done illegally because of these.
Exactly.
But it sounds like your structure with the tenants was actually a solid one with good cash flow and appropriate DHCR compliance.
That was the good part of that deal. That was the good part of that deal. But the thing about that's important about, first of all, I'd like to ask the question is, how long do you tell people it's going to take to get certificates of non-harassment? Because that's a huge.
Doug, you might as well ask me how long I think the city's going to be shut down next. That's a tough one to answer.
Typically,
it's 3 to 9 months from what I've seen.
Yeah, 3 months would be incredible. 9 months to a year is common. And the problem with typically, if you uncover that a property is an SRO or any Class B multiple dwelling, because certificates of harassment apply to every Class B multiple dwelling, it is that you're going to get a discount off of market value for that.
Yep.
Definitely. But the big problem is that you can't pull a permit until you get certificates of non-harassment.
Correct.
You cannot pull a building permit.
Another thing on this topic I want to talk to you guys about is deed restrictions. So a big part of the reason I always recommend pulling at the deed, the simple answer is to, confirm that the appropriate person you're dealing with is the actual owner of record. But in a lot of these townhouses, there's deed restrictions where they may have been in areas in the early 90s that were not considered ideal areas. And the city and HPD would sell the property to an end user who would want to restore it and maybe make it a 3-family, and it requires the owner of record on the deed to actually occupy the property for 25 years. So, for instance, if Kathy bought this building in 1995, which is mainly we saw these in the 90s, and she renovated it, rented out 2 units, lives in one, and here I come in and it's 2020, and I want to basically just be an investor and not live there and live in my apartment and rent this out. I actually can't do that. The deed will restrict that whoever is an actual owner up until, it's usually 25 years. So maybe my 1995 date wasn't great, but say 2005, 25 years, that even I buy from Kathy, albeit I'm not the one who bought from the HPD, I still am subject to that restriction where I have to occupy it till 2030. So, be careful, because if you're marketing a property, I just inherited a file from another lawyer. A client called me up and she's like, I'm in contract. I hate my lawyer. I want to transfer the file to you. Are you willing to take this on? And it's always scary when that happens, because usually there's something that got slipped through the cracks in that scenario. This exact scenario, she retains us, pull up the deed, and I'm like, this is an investor from overseas. And I'm like, did you know that the deed requires you to live there? And she's like, nope, didn't know it. And I'm like, well, you can rent it out, you can buy it, you can still close, but you are at risk if the HPD does any investigation on this, if a tenant gets wind of it, or if they see a transfer went through and they come after you. And I don't know what the recourse will be. They can force you to, they'll probably fine you substantially for, non-compliance. So another very unique aspect of townhouses, which you want to be careful and aware of, don't just look at them. What they look at like today is a beautiful renovated property with, landmark facade. You got to dive into the records, because there's so many skeletons behind these things. It's crazy. I want to also talk about, so we talked about the I-cards, we talked about the COs. I want to talk about changing use and also expanding building townhouses horizontally and vertically. So if you have a client that says, look, I want to buy a 4,000 square foot townhouse, find me one. It's not as simple as just going and searching for, sorry, let me rephrase this. In they're intending on doing work to the property. I think it's advisable to look at what the FAR, available FAR is, floor to area ratio, what the setback lines are if you wanted to expand it, horizontally. One, simple way of doing this is that if you walk down the street and you see townhouses of different heights, chances are the ones with lower heights have remaining for the FAR to use to build up. So that can get you your additional square footage. If you're a listing agent, there's a lot of value in remaining buildable rights. So in evaluating a property, it's imperative that you find out what the FAR is, because you have to factor that into your pricing. Unless
you have to make sure you have to also make sure that you can use the FAR, because not all FAR is usable.
You're jumping to my next point, right? So
because you have landmarks, you have all kinds of shit.
You hit it on the head. What Doug just said was that so if I have additional FAR, the one government entity that trumps everything, and I keep using that phrase, and people always laugh at me. Sorry, I gotta stop coming a different phrase than Trump. The one entity that supersedes everything is landmarks. So if you have FAR of an additional 500 feet or whatever the case may be, if the roof in the facade of the building is landmarked, landmarks can preclude you from using that. So don't jump to the conclusion that that is in fact available. So it's good for you to be aware of, it's good for you to market, and it's good for you to disclaim to the buyer that it's their duty to obtain their independent consultation for the actual use of the realistic use of this.
That's where our friend Nick from TitleVest can be very handy. He just did a great little massing study for me on a townhouse on 35th Street that I'm using, that I'm selling, and it just has odd zoning and an enormous amount of FAR. It's a 6,000 square foot house, but there's 12,000 square feet of additional FAR, which of course you really can't use because of the sliver law, but it became a very important part of this transaction, which is now ending up with a deed restriction on the air rights, which is super an interesting thing. But FAR is not all created equal. Not all of it is usable. In fact, there's a lot of times when it's not usable, or only a part of it is usable.
But that's why I recommend, doing this homework in advance, as far in advance as possible. Another thing I want to talk about is changing uses of townhouses. So a common trend has been religious institutions selling brownstones to either investors or people looking to buy as a primary occupancy. You can convert the use of a townhouse. Oftentimes, the townhouse was changed from residential to commercial a number of years ago. The DOB actually prefers the conversion of commercial to residential as opposed to vice versa, especially when we're talking about landmark townhouses. So I've been involved in a number of deals where a church or synagogue is selling the property, primarily, again, uptown for the most part, and is selling to somebody who wants to convert to residential. So how many of you guys have taken my townhouse CE class over the years? Is there a lot of people on this list, or no? I'll scroll through. Just wave if you have. I see a lot of camera shy people with your bio pictures. All right, so I guess that's not going to work. All right, so I'm going to be redundant in a sense where if you have taken this, you've heard the story already. My favorite townhouse deal of all time, which brings together all of this stuff in one transaction. And I'm going to go back. It's a long story, but it really encompasses everything we're talking about, and also gives you a little bit of funny anecdote on me. So when I was 29, 2 weeks before my 30th birthday, I decided to go out on my own and start my own firm. I guess I was having a quarter life crisis or third life crisis, whatever you want to call it. And I called my parents. I'm starting my own firm, go on my own. And it's the middle of the financial crisis. I did this in 2009, the end of 2009. And my parents, tell me, I don't know whether to tell you congratulations or you're a raging idiot. So yeah, really, good luck to you on how you made this decision in this time. I guess, all right, I'm going to figure it out. So my first deal, right before I leave my firm, my first deal is the one that you guys got the article from the Wall Street Journal in, called Black Synagogue Dispute Snags Buy. I get a call from two of my oldest clients, two of the nicest guys you ever met in your life. Both famous, one's a famous poet, one's a famous author. One was African-American, wanted to buy a townhouse at 31 Mount Morris Park West. That's where they're going to retire. That's where they're family it was originally from. I believe his mother was moving back there. A 10,000 square foot brownstone off Mount Morris Park. And he calls me up and he's like, Pierre, I'm buying this property. Clearly he's not describing it right, but it's like, there's a lot of complications. I don't really get it. The broker's going to send you some stuff, take a look. We trust you'll, be able to get it done. Bear in mind, my first referral, right? Or my first new deal. So I'm sitting there and the broker emails me court order, attorney general letters, summons and complaints. And I'm like, what the hell is this? We're buying a townhouse. What am I getting myself into? So I'm going through all this stuff. Turns out my client was buying this property from an investor. That investor had bought the property from the synagogue. And it wasn't your traditional synagogue. It was your group that, if you guys see the guys who are preaching on the streets with some anger in their voice, like that was this group that sold it, right? So the synagogue sold to this developer. The transaction went through, developer got financing, developer got title insurance. For a religious institution to sell a property, they have to obtain a court order and attorney general approval. And it's two-pronged because the AG wants to make sure that the synagogue is not getting ripped off by a savvy real estate investor, and they're getting fair market value. So part of the application is providing an appraisal to demonstrate the value. Number two, the synagogue and the church or the mosque, religious institutions are not for profit. So they're not paying taxes on this. So the AG wants to make sure that the funds are going to be continuously used for not-for-profit purposes, not for members to abscond with the funds or to derive a profit without paying taxes. The court order, predominantly to make sure that religious corporations are governed by religious corporation law. There's a requisite in terms of voting and how approving a sale takes place. So once you have those two pieces of documents, you can go ahead and conduct a closing, no problem. So my situation, the disgruntled members of the synagogue were suing the investor to reverse the sale, claiming it wasn't an arm's length transaction. It was done in violation of all of the laws I just mentioned, and that the AG approval and the court order were bogus. Now, my client is buying from this person being sued. Now, to make matters worse, the building was a 10,000 square foot landmark building. It originally was used as a Dwight mansion in the late 1800s. I believe the founder of Colgate was the one who occupied it. At some point in time, I think in the 50s, they sold it to the synagogue, and the use was converted from residential to commercial. Now, I'm being told that the building is not in great condition, has been dilapidated to a large extent, and this was on a Friday, I got all this stuff, and that we're going to do the engineer's inspection Saturday morning, 9 a.m., in Harlem in the middle of February. So I sat here, I'm like, you know what? I've never been to inspection in my life. If I'm going to go to one now, sure as hell the time to go. So I go up to Harlem and I remember this. It was like 8 degrees outside. It's freezing cold. I get there, they give me a hard hat to put on. We're walking through this building and it's stunning, but you're seeing like beams falling down. You're seeing wires exposed. You're seeing leaks everywhere. It really was in terrible condition. Now, my client wants to renovate this to occupy. So first question is, okay, it's clearly a landmark building. So if you're a landmark expert in there, landmark expert has to tell you, will your renovations be permitted or not? Number one. Number two, can we change it from commercial to residential, change the use? Answer was yes, especially about to our benefit, the fact that it was originally a residential property and we're restoring it to what it originally was. Number three, is the seller going to end up being a legal owner of the property that can convey title to us? So that's the thing, because if the synagogue is successful in the lawsuit and they reverse the original sale, then that person can't sell to me. So that this even gets more complicated. And this is where it's great to talk about this now, because we're in also another difficult marketplace. This was during the financial crisis. The party that I was buying from was an aspiring developer who was going to convert this to condominiums. They took out a construction loan. So I get a contract emailed to me, 20-page contract, pure custom contract, not boilerplate. And I get to the end of the contract and I'm like, wait, there has to be a page missing in the scan. There's no provision for money being held in escrow. Call the seller's lawyer up. I'm like, hey, you forgot to send me an escrow provision. She goes, no, I didn't. I go, what do you mean? She says, well, it's going to be a pass-through deposit. And I'm like, look, you know, I've been around, I've done a lot of deals in my day. What the hell does that mean? And she says, well, the deposit's going to pass through us and go to our bank. And I go, well, why is your bank to hold the money in escrow? She's like, no, the funds are going to be given to pay down our mortgage. And I'm like, and enlighten me, why in God's name is that going to happen? And the answer was, well, we're in default of our construction loan, and we need to give them a payment for a forbearance or foreclosure, and we're going to use your deposit to give them the forbearance, and that way we can convey title to you. And I go, you have to be on drugs, because not only are you in the middle of a lawsuit, and this is the most convoluted deal of all time, now you want to take my 10% deposit on $2 million, give it to your bank, and if you default, who am I going after? She says, well, you can sue my client. I go, yes, your client who's in default of their mortgage. I go, so a judgment against somebody that's worth nothing is not worth the paper it's written on, right? Let's be practical. So I go, there's no shot in hell I am going to, consent to this not being held in escrow. Again, keep in mind, this is my first deal I'm doing when I decided that I had this brilliant idea of starting a firm in the middle of a financial crisis. So I told myself, if this deal closes, it's a sign from above that this was a smart idea and I'll have a good career. If this deal does not close, I better work on a resume and switch professions. So now I have everything riding on this deal. Now, this thing took weeks and weeks and weeks. Finally, I tell the seller's lawyer, give me the information of your bank. We're going to negotiate a proper forbearance. And what I did, I told my clients, I go, wire me the entire purchase price. Give it to me in advance. I don't care. It's going to sit there for 60 days. Let me hold it in my account. And I showed the seller's bank, I'm fully liquid to complete this transaction in cash. I'm going to put the 10% deposit in escrow. So long as we clear these title issues, you will be fully paid off. There's sufficient equity in there to fully pay you off. It is in your best interest to pause your foreclosure for 60 days, let me close, and you'll get paid off, and the seller will even walk out with a couple bucks. So I had this novel concept. It works. We negotiate for an escrow provision. We have a forbearance in place. We have 60 days to close. All is well in the world. We're going to sign a contract. And my client goes to me, Pierre, well, what's the risk to me if I close on this and this lawsuit doesn't, this lawsuit actually, has some teeth to it? So the risk would be that if the seller sold to me and their transaction was overturned, it would subsequently overturn my transaction and title will go back to the synagogue. Now, what's the one way to hedge against this risk? Is brilliant as I thought everything I was doing was, if I'm wrong, what's my insurance policy? This is the single-handedly best example of where title insurance comes into play. So, I call Nick up and I'm like, Nick, if I can get a title insurance policy, I think I'm dotting my I's and crossing my T's up and down, left and right. I can make this deal happen because in the event I am wrong, title insurance company will have to reimburse my client for 100% of the purchase price. And my client's only risk is their engineer's fees and legal fees. So at the end of the day, that's the benefit. That is the best example of where title insurance actually, it saves the day on a deal, because you can't get more complicated than this. So what ended up happening, luckily the underwriter who underwrote for the seller when they bought was the same underwriter we were using. So that underwriter was intimately involved and knowledgeable on the lawsuit. And they were able to assess that they did not think that the lawsuit had any teeth. It had been already thrown out of court once or twice. The Court of Appeals had thrown it out. It really, it was a meritless suit. So the fact the underwriter was there, they assured me I will get title insurance. So then I tell my client, look, if I am wrong, you're made whole. So great. All is well, right? Go to sign the contract. We're in contract. 2 weeks later, like, here's your report. Let's get this deal closed. Let's close sooner rather than later before, things get even worse. Seller calls me up. Pierre, we got a bit of an issue. I'm like, great, no shit. That was to be expected. Sorry, pardon. I forgot I'm putting this on a website. I shouldn't be using expletives. And I'm like, all right, what do you got now? Well, they filed a list pendants on the property. Okay, well, great. How do we address this? So as you guys are probably aware, list pendants, and when there's a claim made to a property, and it's putting the whole world on notice, filed in court, filed against the property, and it blocks a party from conveying title until that claim has been, rectified. So the synagogue filed the list pendants. Now I'm sitting here, I'm like, all right, you guys got to get this removed. Luckily, they got it removed rather quickly, given the fact that this had been thrown out of court so many times. It gets removed. We clear title. We close on the property. And I ended up making a smart decision to start a practice during a financial crisis. So the Wall Street Journal calls me up. That's the article you guys have. And they're like, we've been tracking this property for years. How the hell did you get somebody to actually buy it and close on it? I go through this whole story. The guy's like, how did you go through all the risks? And I'm familiar with this. And there's been picketing outside of the property. And, what did you do? So I explained to him this whole story. He doesn't get it. And I'm like, look, you don't know me, but I'm pretty conservative in my practice. I'm like, this was not a cowboy move. Like I went through every single thing as thoroughly as humanly possible. So he goes, well, what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong? And I'm like, well, I get title insurance. So if I'm wrong, I'm fine. So the funny thing is, he quotes me in the article that you have at the end of it. And the quote is, after this whole convoluted structure and story, that and attorney Pierre Debbas said that if in the case that the lawsuit did have any merit to it, the title insurance would protect his client. So that was the whole, this whole thing, that's what he extracted out of it. So today, if you guys have been to my office, I actually have this article framed, hanging in my office, is a keepsake because it's hands down my favorite transaction of all time. And obviously, has a nice special meaning to me on a personal, professional level. So that really goes through every single, aspect of where a townhouse can be really, complicated to get done. Has anybody heard of this deal over the years? It was a pretty famous deal. Rebney that year nominated for Deal of the Year, and I have no idea how we didn't win. I wasn't at that dinner, so I don't know who won, but it wasn't us, which is mind-boggling to me. Because I've been doing this now 15 years. They've done thousands of transactions, and I can't come to anything close to something as messed up as that deal. So I'd love to hear it. Did anybody hear of this over time or no?
I want to look it up.
Pierre, it's the second time I've heard it, but it's still as good as the first time.
Thanks, Kathy. I appreciate it.
But I did have a follow-up question, not related to whether I've heard this, which is how do you get a sense of after when a nonprofit entity sells to an individual, how does the property get taxed? And can you get some idea of what the taxes will be subsequent to closing? And also, number two is, and this is a title question, is there any danger, and maybe it doesn't matter if you have title insurance, but could a lis pendens or any kind of lien be filed in between the last title search and when you close, or is the title search done literally a minute before closing?
So they're both great questions. On the first one on taxes, so religious institutions are not for profit, so they're tax exempt. So now, when you're a non-for-profit will be taking ownership, they will be taxed. It's very difficult to figure out what the taxes will be because it depends on the extent of the renovations, how much you're putting into the property. The only thing you can do is try to look at what the taxes are for comparable properties on the same street. But even that's not a perfect solution because those properties may not be as updated as what yours is going to be. And the updating of the property will create a premium in property taxes. So there's no perfect solution. If your client was really adamant about it, you can maybe get a tax searcher or an attorney to give an opinion, but it's probably not worth the expense, given that you can get a pretty good ballpark based off of what the other taxes on the street are.
Will they start paying tax immediately upon closing? If you're buying a religious institution, I'm selling a synagogue right now, and it's a townhouse, and we have a contract out. I don't know, given the circumstances, whether it's going to go through, but one of the issues was the AG approval thing. They were saying it was going to take up to 18 months to get. I had a question for you. What, in your experience, how long it generally takes? And also with regard to taxes, so you're taxed, it's unrenovated upon closing and then retaxed again when you do the renovation. Is that right?
It'll be reassessed, yeah.
Reassessed, okay.
Yep. So, at the closing, there's no taxes due, so there's no adjustment made. Mm-hmm. And then you guys know the tax year in New York City is July 1st to June 30th. So at some point, the Department of Finance will reassess the property and issue a tax bill. When exactly that happens, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
To be honest.
Okay.
And Kathy, to your point, to your question, second question about basically a title search. The title search is updated between the time it's originally issued and closing. So if a list pendants does pop up between the time we receive the initial report and say 90 days till closing, we will be aware of it because there is an update done to the report.
I guess my question is, maybe it's too nuanced, but how close in time to closing and issuance of the title report? Is an additional search done, and is it irrelevant because if the title is issued and they've missed a lien or a lis pendens, maybe it doesn't matter to the buyer?
So it's updated is earliest as the day of closing. So they want to make sure nothing is filed, to the last very second, because if they do miss it, they're insuring it, right? For instance, our firm, we have an active litigation group, and one of our main focal points is title claims related litigation. And the last thing title insurance companies want to do is litigate a potential claim like that, because if they did miss it, they have to pay whatever that claim is themselves. So it's something that we do definitely, and even as representing a buyer, even if I have title insurance, and nobody wants to be involved in a claim like that. So we all make sure that, title is 100% clear at the time of closing. Anybody else have any other questions? Anybody else have any other townhouse deals that they want to share or talk about?
Pierre, there's a question from Fabian in the chat box. Mm-hmm. If you want to address.
Yeah, you mind pulling it up?
Yeah, of course. It says here, question: I sold a townhouse to clients who would now like to buy a floor or two of their neighbor's townhouse. Is there a process for this?
So, townhouse, it's not like a condominium where each unit has its own separate tax lot. No matter how many units could be in a townhouse, the whole building is a one block and lot. So it's not, if you want to buy other floors in an adjoining townhouse. Well, Fabienne, my question is, what's the intended use of those floors? Are they trying to do some kind of unorthodox partial combination? What's the background of this?
There's a great example of this that's out there in the world with our former mayor, Bloomberg.
Hold on 1 second. She just messaged on the bottom. It is for a combination. So if you do want to do combination, you can't combine a portion of someone else's building and not the whole thing. Maybe theoretically speaking, if that person converts their building to condominium and you establish separate lots for each floor, you can do a partial combination of maybe the top 2 floors with your townhouse. But it'd be a huge mess, because number one, you have to convert that building to make each separate floor designated separate real property, and number two, you're going to have joint ownership essentially of a building with a stranger.
Yeah,
I mean, you can
Bloomberg
do
did
it. Pardon?
Bloomberg did this. Bloomberg did this.
It's doable. Yeah,
he actually did do it. He actually did do it. He bought part of his neighbor's house, and it would involve condoing it.
Yeah.
And he bought part of it and expanded his house into the neighboring house.
And the neighboring house and him basically share ownership of a building.
That's correct.
So I can only imagine how complicated that co-ownership agreement would look like, because Bloomberg basically bought 2 condo units in a condo association and combined them with a separate property in a separate entity where there'll be some ingress and egress between the two. I mean, again, I'm sure,
it's totally complicated, but it's essentially what he did was he bought part of the neighboring townhouse. You have to go through, you can do, there's a couple different ways to file a condominium plan. There's a streamlined version of condominium plans and a more formal version of it, but you can do it, and he did do it, and it is complicated, but it's not that complicated, right? I mean, it's like any other two-unit condominium townhouse, right? Somebody owns an upper duplex, somebody owns a lower duplex. You come up with the common charges and taxes for each person, and then, you know, typically the person who owns the upper duplex is responsible for the roof themselves, and the person on the lower duplex has some other responsibilities, and they share some responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, look, yeah, I mean, right. That's a nice summary of it. I would preface it that we could get it done. It would be extremely unorthodox and complicated. And then also you have to have parties that are willing to be, for lack of a better phrase, in bed with one another. You know, like,
that's right.
I don't know many buyers and sellers that want to be married to each other post conveyance of title of a property. This requires you to be married to one another forever. And it also, and depending on the seller who condoed that property out, does that, the fact that they sold those floors and had this unorthodox structure, how does that impede the value of the remaining units that they maintain ownership of? So yes, it is doable. Fabienne, to answer your question, the answer is yes, it is doable. It'll be extremely complicated. And it, more than anything, it requires the appetite of the parties to do everything we just said.
It's actually one of the difficulties in selling small unit condo townhouses, right? Especially 2-unit. Sometimes banks are a little hesitant to lend on 2-unit condos because, you know, you're kind of in bed with two parties.
Of course.
But it's actually getting done more in Brooklyn than it's ever been done. Is people building, really renovating townhouses into 2 expensive condominiums, right? You know, like $3 million a pop.
And I'm sure Bloomberg has a right of first refusal on the remaining units should they ever go
Of
apart.
course.
You know, so there's, again, I'd love to work with someone like this. Sounds fascinating, but I can tell you.
There's a couple of great articles. I only touched on part of that. He's actually grown his townhouses a couple of times, and there's a couple of good articles out there if you want to Google them. It's really fascinating. Super fascinating.
So guys, we have a couple minutes left. I'd love to open it up to questions because I know you guys emailed Al a bunch of questions, and I'm seeing the message board pop up a lot. So let's open it up to see, you know, any questions you guys have on this topic, on anything, any deals you're currently working on, anything in general, to be quite honest with you.
Pierre, I have a question here from Olga that asked, how difficult is it to change a certificate of occupancy?
It all depends on what the change is. If you're looking to make it from a 4-unit to a single family, that's simpler than vice versa, to be honest with you. So it really just depends on what the actual changes are.
Hey, Pierre, thank you for doing this, first of all. I have a buyer who made an offer on a townhouse in Brooklyn who's going from a single family to a family. How long does that take? I mean, he backed out because of the crisis, but I'm sure he's going to go back in when this is all over.
You said from a single family to how many? Sorry?
3 family.
3 family. Okay.
Challenging.
It all depends on the layout of the building, the ingress, egress, the mechanical systems. I mean, it's doable. It just, can you get the proper air and light that's required? You know, oftentimes with these properties, you'll see a ground floor unit, and that unit's not a legal unit because it doesn't have the requisite air and light.
Right.
So, you know, it's people. I mean, people do it. It's certainly doable. It really depends on the dimensions, the infrastructure, and things of that nature.
What kind of due diligence can you do before making an offer? Let's say he hires you as his lawyer. You work with Nick, and then the guys do preliminary due diligence to see how long it would take. Quite
frankly, we don't. Neither Nick nor I get involved in this aspect. It's really the client has to hire an architect. An architect gives them an assessment, and to basically, you know, give them the level of comfort that they can do what they want to do. An architect's the only one that can do it. You know, if any of the 3 of us tried, we'd be, you know, guessing, to be honest.
Okay, thank you.
I can tell you it's extremely complicated. because it triggers a whole bunch of stuff in the multifamily code, the largest of which is it immediately will trigger sprinklers. If it doesn't have sprinklers, you're immediately in sprinkler land, and it's an Alt-1 change. So that's all. It's as Pierre said, it's much more complicated to go to upsize a townhouse or create more units in a townhouse than it is to go the other direction.
I might bug you too, Doug. Thank you, everyone.
Call me anytime. Call me anytime. That's what I do.
So let's open up. Let's get a couple more questions in before we wrap up. And then I have 12 sitting here, so I can definitely pick from any of these if people don't want to ask anything.
Pierre, we have another one here. Can you speak to how party wall agreements are typically agreed upon?
Oh, wow, that's a good one.
That is a good one.
So party walls are when you have, so the interesting thing about townhouses is that you're taking two properties and they're all contiguous and sharing a wall. Oftentimes physically, think about it from a theoretical perspective, if you can lift a townhouse up in the air, chances are its adjoining ones don't have a wall and are exposed. So the way construction worked throughout the years in certain circumstances is that they would build a wall in between so they each have their own separate wall. So if I nail something into my wall, it's not going to my neighbor's townhouse. Now, that party wall and how it's the rules and restrictions in terms of how it's governed is dictated through a party wall agreement, which is filed just like a deed's filed. So you can find party wall agreements on ACRIS. They're not very common. It's been years since I read a party wall agreement on a townhouse deal. But basically, you know, if there's ever a leak, it just talks about the rights and remedies of all the parties. So you would find it on ACRIS just like a deed. But again, not very common. So a lot of the questions I'm looking at here are related to townhouses and the coronavirus, talking about inspectors being essential workers. Would demand maybe increase for townhouses given the pandemic and people's desire to live, you know, not amongst so many people in an apartment building, things of that nature. It's a lot of interesting stuff, to be honest with you. You know, inspectors, I'm not sure if they're deemed to be essential employees. I've not had a property inspected during this. To be honest, I really don't know the answer to that one. In terms of interest in townhouses, yeah, I mean, I can see more of a trend. You know, I'm talking, a lot of our clients are real estate investors, and they're taking the position that they think the outer areas of the city, people are going to be looking more to leave condensed areas such as Manhattan and live in, you know, outer areas like the boroughs or the burbs, and even if it's in apartment buildings, just in less condensed areas. So you can have the similar rationale applied to townhouses that, look, you know, whoever's in the city, you know, our biggest fear in getting an apartment building is that if you're in a building of 400 people and you're pushing an elevator button and you're walking around the lobby, yeah, it is a little troublesome at the moment. Having a townhouse, you know, does mitigate a lot of those concerns. So I can definitely see a trend. It's an interesting point. I can't say for certain what it will be, but I definitely like the anecdote for sure. Cool. Well, if nobody else has any other questions, I went through everything. I'm good. I think we covered everything today. If you do have questions, obviously, you know, I'm always around, so you guys email me or call me anytime. You have all my info. We'll be Anna, we'll chat later on. We'll coordinate next week's session. Anything you guys have coming up? You know, one thing we've been chatting about behind the scenes, a lot of us, is that what's the best way to provide content and information to you guys? Is it through CE classes that we're doing like today for an hour and a half? Is it through the Q&As we did last week? Is it specific topics? Are some topics more relevant or of interest these days than others? So if you guys have suggestions, please, I'd love to hear from you guys. I'm really enjoying doing this every week with you guys. So, you know, thank you for having me. And Nick, unless you or Ann have anything else to say, I'm good to go.
Yeah, we're great. Thank you so much, everyone. And Pierre, this is, like I said, one of my very favorite topics. And to the extent anyone has questions, email us afterwards. I'll shoot them over to Pierre or send them to Pierre directly. Be safe out there, everyone. We look forward to the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Talk
Great.
soon.
Thank you all for being here.